Okay, lesson 7 on the media coursework here, and we're looking at the statement of aims. Okay, so just as a reminder, this is Eduqas component 3, and we're looking at the statement of aims and intentions for the coursework piece. Although we shouldn't call it coursework anymore, it's now a non-examined assessment, which is slightly different. So the statement of aims essentially allows you to outline the way in which you're going to apply the theoretical framework in response to the brief. That theoretical framework being media language, representation, industry and audience. And in a little while we'll look at 4 sort of main questions that you can use to structure your statement of aims that link it back to that theoretical framework in relation to the brief. Okay, so just as a bit of a recap, this does fall into component 3. So you're being assessed in general under this whole piece under AO3, and AO3 essentially says to create media products for an intended audience. That's the key phrase, applying knowledge and understanding of the theoretical framework of media to communicate meaning. There's a total of 60 marks available for component 3, and 10 of those marks come from your statement of aims and intentions. Okay, so the assessment for this component is going to be based on the statement of aims and intentions and the cross-media production. So if you don't submit a cross-media production, obviously you'll be awarded 0 marks for this statement of aims and intentions as well. So it's about setting out what it is you're going to do and then doing that. Okay, that's just a bit of a recap for everybody. So far we have looked at some production research in lesson 2. We've got to know the audience a bit in lesson 5. In lesson 6 we've just looked at page layouts and how you can start to sketch out some page layouts and chuck some ideas around. Today we're looking at the statement of aims. After this we're going to go on to making a plan for how you're actually going to plan your production. Okay, now this is the assessment criteria for the statement of aims and intentions. I've just lifted this straight out of the specification. So you need to produce a statement of aims and intentions to create a cross-media production for an intended audience. The 2 areas that we really must focus on here are cross-media production. So not just one thing, but and not just 2 or 3 things, but a set of production pieces, if you like, that are all linked together. Okay, so it's not to create a multiple piece of production, a multiple amount of things. It's to produce one cross-media production. So that's really important that we keep that in mind, that all of our production across all of these channels needs to be linked up. And for an intended audience, this is the phrase that keeps coming up in the spec. Okay, the intended audience. So keep those in mind, and we'll take a look at the brief and see where we can identify those things. So one of the key things, like I say, is to, in your statement of aims, is to link your statement of aims back to the brief. There are a couple of areas that are easy to overlook on this brief that I've seen students in the past overlooking, because they're quite specific in their requirements. So in some ways the brief is good because it's very specific. In other ways there are some things that you mustn't overlook. So to start with, when we look at the brief, we're looking at the column on the right hand side, and it's easier to say, okay, there's a complete list there on that right hand side of things we need to do, but we need to have a look at the brief as a whole picture and say exactly what do we need to do here to score highly. These are some of the areas initially that you should be looking at. Okay, in your statement of aims it says you have to produce a cross-media production for an intended audience. On the left hand side there, that's the phrase that keeps coming up. On the left hand side there, we can answer that question. Who is the intended audience? We've got 18 to 34-year-old mainstreamers or aspirers. Okay, not mainstreamers and aspirers, mainstreamers or aspirers. So decide which one of those you're targeting, and keep that in mind. We've learnt a bit about what a mainstreamer is and what an inspirer is, but there's no harm in extending that research a bit further. Okay, write it on a post-it note, stick it on the wall by your desk, keep it up there, and everything we do from this point onwards needs to appeal to that intended audience. We need to make sure, and we need to make it clear in our statement of aims and intentions, that what we're doing is targeting that intended audience. Okay, just make that really clear so that we can say you've done that when we're assessing your work. Also, put yourselves in the shoes of a commercial client here that's paying us to create a product for them. If it doesn't hit their target demographic, they're not going to pay us for all this hard work. Your payment for all of this hard work is going to be a really high grade if you go through this process in an efficient way. Okay, and many brands and kind of production offices and that kind of thing, they do have printouts on the wall of target profiles, life-size people, and people that brand is trying to appeal to. And it's a really useful exercise for the producers in that office to be able to look at that life-size image on the wall and constantly think, will the work I'm doing appeal to that target audience? Because if it doesn't, then we need to change the way we're working. And I would really encourage you to get into the same mindset. You might find it useful to do the same thing, print off an image of a person, give them a name, write down what they do for a job, their income, do they drive a car, what kind of car, do they have a family. As much information as you can create about your pretend target audience will certainly help you to ensure that what you're producing appeals to that intended audience. Okay, so you've got to keep that area that's in the bottom left hand side of the screen there. You've got to keep that in mind throughout this whole production process. Okay. Alternatively, if there's someone that fits the target audience really perfectly, just imagine them and think, what I've produced here, would it appeal to them? Yes or no? Okay. Secondly, we're looking at the requirements in the middle column. Okay. Make sure you complete all of this. If there's anything missing, then you could be looking at a bottom band assessment or the equivalent of an E if you're thinking kind of old school. You have to complete everything on this brief to have any hope of achieving high score from this assessment. The third point on the brief, which is very important that I've highlighted here, is constructing a representation of at least one social group plus the 8 original images. Okay, these must be your own original images. I've seen a few coursework pieces that are really nice bits of work, but they don't construct that representation very clearly. So make sure you don't overlook this. It's not that difficult to just adapt things to include the construction of a representation. So just be prepared to make changes if you need to throughout this process, and reflect on your work and constantly refine it to make sure that you're doing these things. And then what's left on the page here is essentially a to-do list. So make sure you complete that to-do list. There's 20 marks available there for just meeting the brief. So make sure you set out in your statement of aims how you're going to bring all of these things to life. And we'll look at 4 kind of big questions to make sure we hit that theoretical framework shortly. Moving on to task 2, my students have all been encouraged to go down the route of the magazine brief with task A, or option A for task 2, because just as a centre we're pretty well geared up for this, but also it's quite a nice one to choose from, to be honest. Your school may have given you a different set of briefs depending on the equipment that you've got, but in any case, analysing the brief in the way that we're doing right now, regardless of which brief you've got, is definitely an important exercise. So again, looking at the areas that could easily be overlooked here, make sure you keep that intended target audience in mind, and make sure that you produce exactly what is required and that you construct a representation and have at least 5 original images. Okay? At all times, keep that intended target audience in mind and make sure you complete each bullet point on the list to get yourself up the assessment criteria. It's often just a simple case of doing what you've been asked to do to start with. Sounds simple, but if you just complete all of the things on that list to start with, you're going to be in a good place, and then you can maybe refine what you've produced to improve the quality of it. So if we break down those overall requirements into some kind of to-do list, what we're looking at here is, this is something like a to-do list for task 1. I've tried to include as many specific things as I can, but on top of this, there's the overall targeting of the intended audience, and there's the overall representation of at least one social group. But if we're looking at a specific list of things to do, this is what the task 1 would look like, and for task 2 it looks something like this for the main part of the task. Obviously, once this has all been produced, it's worth looking at the brief again, ensuring that you've met all of the points on there. Sometimes that's just a case of grabbing a highlighter, printing off the brief, just going through and saying, have I done this, highlight it off, and ensure that there's nothing left out. I'll attach these 2 documents as a Google Doc to-do list in the description below, and you can just tick those things off as and when you've done them. But our first point of assessment when we're assessing your work is saying, have they responded to the brief? Have they created a working homepage, for example, yes or no? However many things you have or haven't done is going to help us as assessors to decide where you fall in that 20 mark column for responding to the brief. Okay, so the whole time we're trying to look at this kind of list of what is required. Coming back to that statement of aims then, because this is what we're really focusing on today. Now that we've broken down the brief into exactly what's required and who we're targeting, we have to look at how we can write a statement of aims to the best of our ability that's going to give you the best possible score. And just as a recap, there are a few things you need to know about the statement of aims. It's worth 10 out of your 60 marks for component 3. It should be written after you've researched brands that currently exist, but it should be written before you start your production. In reality, you might go back and adjust this a little bit before the final whole NEA piece is handed in, and while there's not a word count as such, it should be around 500 words in length. Students do get hung up on this because it's nice to know exactly what's required, isn't it? But the exam board aren't specific on that. I would maybe aim for give or take 10% on that word count. If you're heading towards 15 or 20% above or below that word count, then it might start to affect your grade. You're not going to get pulled down for going over the word count, so it does depend on what you've written. But for us to be able to say that you've written approximately 500 words, if you're 20% over that, then it starts to become difficult for us to justify that. Okay, so try and keep it around the 500 mark. Could be bullet pointed, doesn't have to be written in extended form, and you certainly won't be penalised for bullet pointing your statement of aims. A lot of students bullet point things, and that is absolutely fine. Let's have a look at some of the questions that you should be addressing, because what we need to do is make sure we meet that assessment criteria. If I just go back a slide, creating a cross-media production for an intended audience. Okay, cross-media production, intended audience, and the theoretical framework. How well have you recognised that theoretical framework? These are some of the questions that are going to help you to be able to answer that. Okay, how and why will you use media language in your cross-media production? So you need to justify some of the choices you've made in regards to your selection and combination of the elements of media language that you intend to use. Why have you selected a portrait close-up, for example, on the front cover of your magazine? And why have you combined that with certain colours and certain fonts? Just explain that, okay? If there are any intertextual references or any genre hybridity, there's an opportunity to mention that under this kind of main heading, if you like. How you intend to use genre conventions to communicate meaning. From a media language point of view, for your chosen genre or your chosen subgenre, how are you going to follow those conventions? And what's the overall message that you intend to communicate to the intended audience? there's a good chance here, good opportunity for you to show your understanding of something like semiotics, for example. Okay, and this is essentially focusing on media language and demonstrating your understanding of that theoretical framework and how you are going to apply that to create your product. Okay. Then we move on to that second part of the theoretical framework. How will you construct representations, and why will you construct representations of, this could be individuals, it could be groups, it could be certain issues or certain events. You know, we can represent anything really, can't we? Just how and why. Make sure you set out really explicitly what you're going to do. So are you going to use visual codes and technical codes? I mean, you are going to use visual and technical codes, whether you're aware of it or not. There are visual codes in the things that you produce, aren't there? But, you know, why have you chosen those certain codes, and how do you think that's going to construct a representation? How will the representations in your work construct a version of reality? Will you be including misrepresented or underrepresented groups within your product? And how will the way in which you construct the representations communicate meaning to your audience? If you can answer some of these simple questions, then you're starting to really demonstrate your knowledge of that theoretical framework, and you're starting to really apply that. Okay. Are you going to be challenging or subverting any stereotypes? Again, that's a key point, and there's an opportunity there for you to mention that. Coming back to the intended audience, how are you going to target your audience? Say in explicit terms, I am going to do this to try and appeal to my intended audience, which is. So what are some of the methods you're going to use to position your brand in line with your audience? What are some of the elements of media language that you're going to use? How might those things appeal to that target audience? And what's the mode of address that you're going to use? Is it going to be a formal mode of address? Is it going to be an informal mode of address? It's got to fall in line with your target audience, your intended audience, and explain how that is going to do that. Moving on to industry then. You know, how are you going to follow industry standards? I get students that say, I don't want to follow convention. Well, that's fine, but to start with, you have to really create a conventional product. And if you want to then verge away from that convention, you know, you can do that if it's justified. But to start with, create a conventional product, and then by all means make some changes or refine it or adjust it. But to start with, you know, you really need to start in a conventional place to justify the fact that you are following an industry context. What do you think the expectations are from your audience? And how does your product reflect the values of the supposed organisation? So remember, this is for a major publishing organisation. How is your product going to reflect the values of a major publishing organisation? And then finally, I just think it's worth putting this question in here. How will you demonstrate digital convergence? Some of the things you want to talk about is a consistent house style, the use of colours, certain typeface, stylized images that are the same across the brand. Yeah, we need to look at your website, we need to look at your audiovisual and your magazine, and we need to know that they all come from the same brand. So you have to demonstrate that digital convergence if you want to score really highly. And in your statement of aims, use subject-specific terminology. Make it clear to the assessor that you are a media student. Okay, I don't want to read a statement of aims and know that anybody could have written it. I want to read it and know that it's been written by a media student. Okay, so take that knowledge you've got, put it on the page, and refer to some research wherever you need to. Okay, so if we just come back to the overall objective here, we have to produce a statement of aims and intentions to create a cross-media production for an intended audience. Just to quote the assessment criteria here for a Band 5 submission, we're looking for That's a top band submission. We're looking for an excellent, highly detailed statement of consistently relevant aims and intentions that clearly responds to the brief, targets the intended audience, and reflects the specified industry context. Okay, so media language is coming up there, industry context is coming up there, the intended audience is coming back in there. The aims and intentions demonstrate a plan for thorough and sustained use of appropriate codes and conventions and insightful representations. Excellent evidence of application of knowledge and understanding. You've got that knowledge and understanding. Just make sure that you evidence how you've applied it. Okay? And sustained use of highly appropriate subject-specific terminology that's within your product and within your statement of aims. So make it clear to us that you're a media student, okay? And these are the key points in the statement of aims. It should be around 500 words in length. Feel free to use those questions I've put up as kind of starter points if you like. You should be talking about media language, representation, industry context or industry standards, who your intended audience is and how you're going to target them, and how you're going to ensure that there is digital convergence. I'd suggest maybe getting in touch with a friend who's also doing this, swap, kind of peer assess each other's work. The assessment criteria, I will add a link to that in the description below so that you can assess each other's work against that criteria, and that's a really good exercise to do. So I'll leave this slide up for a little while so you've got these key points up here in front of you. If you've got any questions at all, just add them to the comments below. For my students, head over to Google Classroom. You'll find the Component 3 cover sheet. That's where your statement of aims should end up, in that cover sheet. There should be a copy under your work on the right hand side of the screen. Get your statement of aims in there, and then we'll make a start on planning the production in the next lesson.